Hi everybody. My name is Karine Kleinhaus, and I'm a new member of the faculty at SoMAS. And I'm super excited that you guys are here so I can tell you a little bit about coral reefs and what's going on with them, because it's a pretty hot topic, literally and figuratively. So we'll get into that. Before I touch on the coral, since you guys are new students and starting a new chapter in your academic careers, I'll just tell you 2 words about myself. So my name's Karine, and you could see from the starting slide that I have a whole mess of letters following my name. And one of them is I used to be an obstetrician. I did research for many years, worked at a biotech, and then I came to SoMAS. And when I decided to go into marine biology, and I did a master's in marine conservation and policy, which was a fantastic experience. And then I joined the faculty here at SoMAS. So the reason I tell you that is just as you start off on the next leg of your academic career, it's super important to remember to keep your eyes open, to follow what interests you, and never to worry if you're changing directions or going after something new, because believe me, others have done it before you, and it's always worth the time and the effort. So that's my 2 cents, and now we can get into coral reefs. So first of all, I think everyone's seen pictures and knows that coral reefs are beautiful, but aside from those people who snorkel or scuba dive, I think there's always a question of, okay, we hear a lot about coral bleaching. Why do coral reefs even matter so much? There's so many other issues on the table now in terms of conservation and sustainability. So coral reefs matter a lot besides the fact that they're so beautiful. They cover about 1%, actually less than 1% of the surface area of the ocean. However, they support about 25% of all marine life. Whether that's throughout the life cycle, or some species come to breed on the reef, or some species lay their eggs there, some species have just to sort of use it as a nursery, species come to get cleaned, have parasites removed by animals that live on the reef. It's a really super integral part of the life and the ecosystems in the ocean, and quite critical. Another significant value of coral reefs is they generate about $300 to $400 billion in value each year for people who live on the coast near them, whether it be through actual food, livelihood from tourism, fishery, commercial fishing, and medicine. So livelihood from tourism is very significant. In some places, it can be the majority of income for communities. To give you an example of how significant it is, in Egypt, more people come to visit the reefs than come to visit the pyramids. And that's sort of to give you an idea of what a big deal they are for a lot of nations. And they're a very important source of medications. As a matter of fact, remdesivir, which is one of the first FDA-approved medications for COVID, is based on a molecule that was discovered in sea sponges that live on reefs. So we really do need to think about them as an important global resource and not just something pretty that we're losing. And this super rich ecosystem is really actually on the verge of collapse. It's not like, 100 years or 300 years from now. It's happening now. We've lost over half of the world's coral reefs, and it's estimated that only 10% are going to survive mid-century, which is 30 years from now. We're going to be down to 10% of reefs worldwide, and this is a big deal, and it's happening now, and it's something we really need a lot of young people to get involved with in science and policy and conservation of these resources. So that's something I think that I really hope people get interested in. So when we talk about, if we go back, we talk about bleaching. That's sort of how coral reefs die. And that's sort of the term that people use. So what we mean when we say bleaching is the following. So on the far left, you can see the coral. It's an animal. Corals are animals, so they look a little plant-like. They're all these polyps, which you can see the second picture in is like, looks like a flower. That's the polyp, that's the mouth of the coral. And the coral actually get their color from algae that live inside the cells of the coral animal. It's a relationship where the algae get protection and they make most of the coral's food for it. When you have, when the waters of the ocean get hot, this relationship is disrupted and the corals spit all the algae out. And then what you're left with is on the right, the white coral skeletons, which just shows the calcium carbonate that forms the skeleton of the coral. And this is sort of the term bleaching because it turns white, and generally they can either recover if the algae come back, or they can die, which is very often the case once they bleach to this degree. So what's the story and how exactly is this bleaching happening, or why is this bleaching happening? So here's the chain of events. It's basically due to the increased levels of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. And you'll hear people say, well, carbon dioxide's gone up and down over the millennia. You know, who's to say this isn't just part of the natural cycle? So this is a slide that I really like people to see. This is based on an ice core that was taken out in Antarctica. For the last 400,000 years, they've calculated the carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. And you can see that it does vary quite a bit. But then to the far right, where we are in last year, 2019, was 413 parts per million carbon dioxide. And you can see that's several orders of magnitude higher than where it was just a little while ago, and certainly significantly higher than anything we've seen in the last 400,000 years. So through a range of processes, which I won't bore you with, when you have more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the heat of the sun gets trapped and the earth warms, which is what's happening now. And you can see not only does the earth warm, but the land, but the sea warms. And you can see here that, you know, there's been a steady increase since we've started with, you know, fossil fuels. You can see that the sea surface temperatures have been steadily increasing. And that's, when it gets hot, that's what gets corals to lose their algae and bleach and die. And I won't go through too much more of the science, but you can see sort of what a coral reef looks like when it's bleached. And this is from the Great Barrier Reef. I believe that was.
And as I shared,
I'm sorry? Oh, okay, I guess someone unmuted. However, all is not lost, because there are a few reefs in the world who are not bleaching and who are not suffering as the temperatures rise. And perhaps the largest and certainly a very rare coral refuge from climate change is found in the Gulf of Aqaba, which is with this red arrow here. And this Gulf of Aqaba, which is in the northern Red Sea, is actually doing very well as the temperatures rise. So most coral will die if you raise their average temperature 1 to 2 degrees centigrade above what they're used to. But the coral in the Gulf of Aqaba are more than happy if you increase the temperature 1, 2, 3, 4 degrees centigrade, and only about 5 or 6 degrees centigrade above what's common now will you start to see bleaching for them. So they're really set up to survive for a very long time, even as the oceans are warming. And this is sort of because of the fact that they were selected at the end of the last ice age. I won't really go into the specifics of it, but enough to say that certain coral who could survive very hot and salty atmospheres, environments rather, were selected, and those are the ones who are thriving now in the Gulf of Aqaba and the northern Red Sea, and they're being very happy even as the temperatures continue to rise, and that's been shown for a long time. So now, sort of going back from the Gulf of Aqaba to New York, I'd like to tell you about 2 NSF-funded research programs at SoMAS that are studying these uniquely resilient corals of the Gulf of Aqaba. And these are both new programs, and they really offer, I think, a lot of opportunities for students at every level to get involved and learn more about these special coral and coral reefs in general. So coral reefs need to be in a happy, healthy temperature, but they also need to reproduce to maintain themselves and retain the whole reef architecture. And there's a lot to learn about how corals reproduce. There's actually not too much known if you compare it to what's known about fish or many other marine animals. And there seems to be a big problem with coral reproduction. For example, in the Great Barrier Reef in 2018, there was just about a 90% decline in new coral growing, indicating a real threat to recovery of the Great Barrier Reef, which is now about, I think, 67% dead. So it's really time to better understand this reproduction. So the way that corals reproduce is they have eggs and sperm that meet in the water. They spawn at a specific time, and they use hormones that we have and many other animals have. They have estrogen, they have testosterone, they have progesterone, and they use that, though nobody's really looked at how. So the first of these two programs here at SoMAS are looking at the role of steroids and looking at the roles of rising temperatures in coral reproduction, and specifically looking at how those are involved in reproduction in these resilient coral in the Gulf of Aqaba. So it's a lot of fun, it's very interesting, and if some of you want to learn more, we can certainly talk more about the program, but probably not at this juncture because I want to keep to time. The second program is about corals and aging. So classically, corals are thought of as immortal. They can live, the colonies can live hundreds of years, even thousands of years. There are colonies of cloned polyps, so they're considered one organism. And there's a lot of debate as to whether they are actually happy and healthy when they're 500 years old, or if they do undergo a slow process of aging. And this is important because now when people are trying to farm coral or reseed coral reefs, you want to know if you're taking old coral and putting it out there, is that going to work well, or are you sort of setting up the reefs to fail? So this is an important question that really needs to be addressed, and that's what the second program is looking at. And I'm running that program as well out of the Gulf of Aqaba in Eilat in Israel. Though of course I'm based here at SoMAS. So for both of these, I'm using a Red Sea simulator, which was designed by my colleague. Super cool technology. There's a robot that monitors everything. All the tanks can be controlled remotely, so I can control tank conditions and tank monitoring here in New York while the experiments are running there. And it's a really cool technology. Happy to talk about that more as well. You can see here are some experiments running in the background there. And the last thing I want to touch on is opportunities for students to get involved in coral research and also in science communication at SoMAS. So there is an Alan Alda Center for Science Communication, and there's a lot of ways you can get to science communication. But in both of the coral programs that I'm running, I'm emphasizing science communication. I think that as a whole, as scientists, we've been focused on our own thing and distracted and haven't really done an amazing job of motivating people to care about things like ocean warming and getting people to push for policies that protect oceans and that reduce carbon emissions, et cetera. And that's really a failure on our part in the science community. And I think it's something that new scientists need to learn and to do a better job at. And so opportunities for students in this coral program include things like doing coral dissection with me in the lab here at SoMAS, samples that I brought over from Israel, but also participating in things like social media posts and designing strategies for social media posts to educate about corals, targeting high school students, you and other college students, the general public, about the corals, about climate refuges, and the need for regional collaboration in politically sensitive areas on research and conservation. A lot of aspects of science communication that I think might also be interesting for people to get involved with. And of course, people come up with their own ideas, and if there's a way to integrate them, I'm happy to work with that as well. So that's it in a nutshell. Thank you. I hope it was interesting. And if anyone has questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Oh, we do have a few questions. The first question is, are there other areas besides the Gulf of Aqaba that may survive long-term?
So that's a great question. There are a few other places in the globe that people are evaluating for that, but nothing as big as the Gulf. So there's about there are sections, for example, of the Great Barrier Reef, where in the initial major bleachings in 2016 and 2017, the southern part of the reef was protected and didn't have major bleaching, and it was the northern part that was decimated. But in this last bleaching in March, there was a lot of damage as well in the southern part. So that was one area where we thought there was going to be some protection, but it doesn't seem to be holding up. What's really key and to this is whether the corals are living sort of at their threshold. So if the water gets warmer, they're in trouble, or if they're currently in the ocean conditions are well below the threshold after which they bleach. So in the Gulf, there is 5 to 6 degrees centigrade of a cushion, if you will, between where they are now in 27, 28 degrees centigrade water and where they would bleach if the water reached that temperature. And so that's, as far as I know, it's the largest sort of cushion for survival past the next few decades.
Thank you. We have another question. Are there opportunities for undergraduates to become involved in research like yours?
So there certainly are undergraduate opportunities to do research. The mechanics of how you apply or sign up, I'm not as familiar with. That would be something that someone who's been at SoMAS, in the administration or something, or an advisor could probably answer better. I'm not so familiar with the mechanics because I'm relatively new here. But there certainly are opportunities in my program, in the two coral programs. But how you would sort of do it the right way in terms of signing up, I would have to point you to someone at SoMAS administration to answer that better.
Yes, and you can always email if you go to the contact information page for SoMAS, all of the different contact information for undergraduate advisors are there, and any of them would be happy to help assist in connecting undergraduate students with research opportunities that exist. Another question we have is, can you explain the reason behind the resiliency behind the Gulf of Aqaba a little more?
Sure, absolutely. So let me, I'm assuming you can still see my screen.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so this is the story. So actually, I'll start with the slide. It's probably a little bit better. There it is. So in the last ice age, right? So when the ice and the glaciers form and grow, they suck up the seawater, and then the sea, oops, it's a little bit touchy here. So the sea level drops all around the world, including in the Gulf. And the entrance of the Gulf to the Gulf, actually the entire Red Sea, the entrance is the Bab el-Mandeb Strait that connects it to the Arabian Sea, is quite shallow. So when the sea levels dropped so significantly at the last ice age, the entire Red Sea, not just the Gulf of Aqaba, was completely cut off from open circulation. And it's very hot there. There's no rivers emptying in. There's almost no rain at all. And so it became there was a lot of evaporation. It became extremely hot and extremely salty. And so pretty much all marine life died there in the entire Red Sea. And then at the end, when the ice age ended, the ice melted and the sea levels rose again. Then you had a reestablishment of the circulation, and the more, quote unquote, fresher ocean water came in. And with it, all the eggs, sperm, embryo, everything that from the marine life that was coming from the Indian Ocean, the Arabian Sea, could come and recolonize the Red Sea. but only those corals which could survive the super hot, super salty conditions, especially in the southern Red Sea, could make it up to the northern Red Sea and the Gulf of Aqaba. So it's much cooler in the north than it is in the southern Red Sea. It's much cooler in the northern Red Sea and the Gulf of Aqaba. So even though the corals that we have there today are happy in much hotter water, they're living in a much cooler conditions. They were selected, though, as these survivors of hot conditions, and that's who we have there now, and that's how it came about.
We have another question. Is it true that there is coral in the Arctic? And if so, do we know how they are being affected or impacted?
So I'm not the authority on coral in the Arctic. The thought of diving in the Arctic horrifies me. Really, the people who do are super brave. As to how it's faring, I don't really know. But what I can tell you is generally with coral, deep sea coral, the deep coral and the shallow coral, which are different. When they're usually, except for exceptions like the corals in the northern Red Sea and the Gulf of Aqaba, they're usually pretty closely attuned to where they're growing, and they're very adapted to the current conditions where they live. So, and they cut all kinds of corners so that they can be efficient and healthy in that specific environment, and they evolve over millennia to be super suited to that environment. So generally, if the temperature rises, which it is in all the oceans, you will throw them off, and they will have to spend a lot more energy maintaining homeostasis and health in a new environment, which they're not really programmed for. And that's when they run into trouble. So though I can't speak specifically to those coral, that's just generally a rule about organisms or corals in general. If it changes and they're not adapted to that, it could go either way for them.
Another interesting question that came in is, and I guess they mean kind of on a hyper individual level, what is one thing we can do today to help support coral reefs?
So the main thing, the number one thing that's killing them is global warming and climate change. So if I had to pick one thing, I would say it's to vote for politicians who are going to support policies that are going to shift us to clean energy and reduce our use of fossil fuels, and locally perhaps to press university systems, other groups that you're involved with, to divest from fossil fuels. In terms of coral reefs specifically, to support them, I'd say everything from voting to, if you visit them, to be careful not to step on them, not to land on them, not to pollute on them, and probably raise as much awareness as you can with others who are also going to vote to improve conditions for them and the rest of us on this planet.
And another question that came in, is there a hope of transplanting resilient corals to other areas and have them survive?
So that's a big debate in the field. So there's a tremendous amount of money and energy in important labs, like not fringe labs, like important places like Moat, like in Florida, in a lot of places in Australia that are working very hard on either breeding and putting coral seedlings back, baby corals or fragments of corals back on reefs that have died, or trying to hybrid breed corals that will have resilience or resistance to thermal stress, and putting those back on the reef. So there are people who, real, established and respected scientists who definitely go that route. I personally am not as, haven't really bought into that as much for a few reasons. Number one, if you, breed and reproduce and you have coral fragments, or you've made baby corals and you put them back, but the water is still too hot, it doesn't matter. If the pollution's coming in and the water's too hot, whatever you plant back there is going to die as well. You haven't changed the conditions that killed the parents. It's extremely expensive, and there is no way right now of scaling up. So For example, the longest reef was the Great Barrier Reef. Now the longest living reef is the reefs of the Red Sea. These are 2,000. The Great Barrier Reef is 2,000 kilometers long. The Red Sea Reef is 4,000. It's up one coastline of 2,000 and down the other is another 2,000. The scale of going with an individual robot or an individual person and planting reefs, you're not going to touch this scale. The other problem is if you bring resilient reef directly, there's a question as to whether they will survive in a different environment where there's different fish, different bacteria, different algae. They may not be suited to that environment, and that hasn't really been definitively shown. And then there's the question of reproduction in these other environments. So I'm not sold on that approach. I think our only approach is to save what's left by reducing pollution and light stress and things like that on the reefs that we still have, and trying to slow global warming to preserve what we have. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of species on these reefs of just coral, and then fish, and then sea urchins, and everything else. And to reproduce that ecosystem as a person, as a team, planting some coral in small areas, I don't think is really valid at this time for long-term success.
Thank you. We have one final question. How did you choose corals as your kind of next phase in what to study with all of your previous accomplishments?
So yeah, I do get that question quite a bit, including from a lot of people that are in my family, etc. So I've been diving in the Red Sea since 1993, and I'm deeply, I would say, in love with those reefs and the magic that's there, not just the science, but beauty and the richness. It's really something incredible. But I've dove a lot of places, including the Great Barrier Reef, starting 20 years ago, and all over the Caribbean and many other places, and seeing reefs that you know die while you're busy doing other things. At a certain point, my last job, I was an executive in a biotechnology company, which was really cool and really interesting. But over the last year or two before I switched and went to SoMAS to do a degree, I just was thinking constantly about the reef and feeling like this is going to disappear. My kids are never going to see a healthy reef. Like, I had this feeling that if I needed to devote my time and my energy to that if I could. And so eventually I translated that preoccupation into doing the master's at SoMAS, and then developing a research program here.
Thank you so much.
As crazy as it sounds, I will add, because I was a reproduction biology specialist as an OB and as a researcher, and I'm studying reproduction in coral. And I looked a lot at telomeres and aging in human cells, and that's also what I'm looking at in coral. So it's not quite as crazy as it sounds.
Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. And just so everyone knows, the presentation was recorded and will be available on the SoMAS YouTube channel within the next few days. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks very much. Hope to see you guys around. Take good care.